saw the United States as being the indispensable power, as the global hegemon, the state that needed to be consulted on any issue in international relations, and that could play a decisive role in promoting international as well as regional security and stability. And that has come to an end.
Professor Taliaferro, Lasha, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for coming to Georgia, to this very wonderful and very useful forum of international relations and global affairs, global politics, which is badly needed to be discussed, the issues that we are discussing on this forum. So thank you so much for your participation in this forum, and thank you so much for organizing that.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You did a good job
for having
for
us.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. So let's say, though, one of the main panels on this forum was about the return of the history. What does it really mean, return of the history? Where we lost the history? What was the period of time when we lost the history, and what we can call, what the starting point we can call the return of the history?
Well, I did not name the panel myself. That was Lasha's choice.
Guilty as charged, yes.
But I would interpret that to mean the end of unipolarity and the emergence of a great power rivalry, a new Cold War between the United States on the one side and Russia and China on the other. We're coming off of a 30-odd year period in which the United States not only had an overwhelming preponderance of military and economic power, but in which successive U.S. presidential administrations and Congresses saw the United States as being the indispensable power, as the global hegemon, the state that needed to be consulted on any issue in international relations, and that could play a decisive role in promoting international as well as regional security and stability. And that has come to an end. That is diminishing as we speak. And so I think that is one of the concerns that motivated the panel. How can states, small states, although Georgia is not necessarily a tiny state, but how can small states and regional powers navigate this changing geopolitical landscape in which the United States is less willing, is less able to play the leadership role that it once did, and China and Russia are more assertive on the world stage than they were just 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago.
Lasha, what was the reason behind the name of the, for your point of view?
Sure. Just like it's not much, the reason behind this title is not much different than what Professor just described. But just to describe to your audience, we all know Frank Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history and the last man, and basically, it goes into much more detail, of course. But the basic thesis was that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, America was just going to become bored with the absence of strategic threat that the Soviet Union represented, the end of history alluded to the idea that the Cold War, even though there was an alliance between the United States and, say, Stalinist Russia during World War II, all that changed, and then we have this long period of Cold War, terrifying era in international relations, and that was over, basically, and that just because the Soviet Union collapsed, history of the Cold War with it would disappear. And perhaps also, the notion of vital national security interests or concerns with security threats, all of that was supposed to be flattened. and the United States was basically going to guarantee sort of peace all over the world under the U.S. primacy. And we are seeing that we're witnessing now as a fact that it was fundamentally wrong. It lasted, though, right, Professor? I mean, it did last, and it had some positive aspects to it. But it turned out to be very superficial in terms of the United States taking this global responsibility to run the world and to guarantee that peace. And cracks started to show. In 2000, I would say, in 2014, I would say, when the coup happened in Kiev. Those were sort of the first signs, and then obviously came the invasion. But then of course, NATO expansion, the first two tranches of NATO expansionism, and then 2008. The idea that Georgia was going to become member of NATO. So that was sort of the, consequence of that unilateral foreign policy and sort of post-Cold War hubris, if you will.
Before we go further towards the multipolarity, which is the main issue today, I believe, in the global politics. So this is also very important to understand that the return of history by its side means also the return of the real politics, realism in the international relations. Is that true?
Well, realism never went away.
Okay.
Realpolitik never went away. There were many commentators, many scholars, and many policymakers in Washington, D.C. and in other capitals during the 1990s and in the 2000s who very much wanted realpolitik to go away in favor of idealpolitik, in favor of ideological crusades, ostensibly, in support of humanitarian aims, humanistic aims. But the realities of power politics never went away, and even even though policymakers, say in the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration, would couch their arguments in favor of NATO expansion in terms of, we're doing this to spread liberal democracy or to consolidate liberal democracy and to consolidate the transition from centrally controlled economies to free market economies. There was always a realpolitik calculation, and that calculation was that, Russia is much, much weaker than the Soviet Union was, and there's a power vacuum, and now this is our opportunity to lock in this favorable distribution of power when Russia is least able to offer any sustained resistance to it. So I reject, the premise that realism went away. What did go away was a conception of the limitations of power and the realization that the distribution of power and influence never remains constant. It changes over time. And that the willingness and the ability of the United States, of the American political system, and of the American people to sustain 20 years of warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, paid for not by higher taxes but by borrowing. What changed was the political calculation and the willingness of people to pay for that. And said, no, why are we doing this? This is just simply not sustainable. We went into those particular countries with hubristic ambitions. We're going to remake them into model democracies, and we're going to pour enormous amounts of blood and treasure into them. And then, guess what? After 20 years, it didn't happen. So realism was always there. It was cast aside. It was disparaged by many in favor of idealpolitik. Where I think this, becomes relevant for states like Georgia and other states in the South Caucasus, indeed all of the states along the periphery of the Russian Federation, is, I think, a realization that some of the exorbitant promises that were made by the United States to these states in the 1990s and especially in the 2000s are not going to come to pass simply because the United States is not prepared to go to war with Russia to defend states in, the former Soviet space. We'll fight a proxy war, and that's what's happened with respect to Ukraine, but we're not going to go to war with Russia directly. The cost and risk to us would be enormous.
Yeah. Whether the comeback of the Trump means that the realism is becoming the mainstream.
I think it's very difficult to. U.S. policymakers do not think in terms of international relations theories. They just don't. And Donald Trump does not think in terms of international relations theories. Donald Trump is a businessman. He's a real estate developer. We can argue as to whether there is a grand strategy, a Trump doctrine. I particularly don't think that there is. I think that Donald Trump is a much more short-term, transactional type of president, and somebody who gets very easily distracted and who has a very short attention span. I think that one of the things that propelled Donald Trump into the presidency, first in 2016 and then again in 2020, were several things. One of them was a deep dissatisfaction by a sizable portion of the American electorate about the United States' role in the world and about the impact that was having on the domestic economy in the United States, but also this anti-elitism, anti-establishmentism. And you see, especially the second Trump administration, at war with the so-called U.S. foreign policy establishment, national security establishment, and trying to pursue a very different set of policies, whether we're talking about, the continual threat of tariffs on most other states, or whether that is, rethinking the role that the United States is going to play in Euro-Atlantic security, or the considerations regarding what role the United States is going to play in the security of the Indo-Pacific region. But I'm hesitant to cast Donald Trump or the people around him as necessarily being realists.
Okay, great. So, Lasha, as I understand, the unipolarity by itself is a kind of idealistic idea, because when you are alone, you're trying to somehow to establish your rules, your stuff, your ideas, and etc. Does it really mean, on the opposite, that the multipolarity is a more realistic idea?
I will attribute sort of the rise of multipolarity to power, to rise of power, to states becoming powerful, and then translating that power into implementing their own national security interests as they see it. And that results eventually, because China existed before multipolarity, and so did Russia, but they were down and out. And it was the United States dominance that sort of overshadowed everyone else. And so we can call it multipolarity, we can just call it rise of China, but yeah, there are poles, multipolarity basically means that there is more than one great power in the international system that can challenge another great power. And that sort of automatically means that in relative terms, the United States power will be diminished. I'm not saying the United States is still the most powerful state on the planet, extremely wealthy country, and it's under no threat by anyone. But United States does not like sort of geopolitical hierarchies, states coming up in the region, becoming potential regional hegemons, and it will do. I think it will go out of its way to, I think, balance China or contain China. There are all kinds of ways of looking at it. There are debates going on as we speak, but yeah, that's basically so more powers arise. You're going to have the sort of the more multipolar the world becomes. In this case, we have besides the United States, we have two powers, maybe Russia a distant third, but nevertheless, it is a challenge to the United States to roam freely for wanting to roam freely as it did in the past. But I just wanted to make a few comments on Trump too. Yeah, defining Trump. I mean, I don't think he's got plenty of advisors and all that, but he doesn't look at the world in terms of realist or liberal theories. But I would say that he is pragmatic, though, Professor. Right? Would you?
I would say yes. He can be pragmatic.
Right. He can be very pragmatic, and he can say, "Why do we need to go to war with anyone if we can basically make money and create peace that way?" So there was some realism to it, perhaps not scholarly realist sort of instinct, but he does have some sort of a pragmatic approach to international relations, and that helps, in my view, to decrease chances for hubris, for another sort of this unilateral America first type overextension, if you will. But let's make no mistake. I mean, if there is necessity for Trump, and if his administration sees that there must be some sort of a regional escalation that's needed, they will not hesitate to do it. So it's not as if it's all peace and love, but yeah, but there is on the fundamental level, there is a recognition that what was happening prior to his administration, prior to 2016, was no longer sustainable. So let's try something else. Let's call it pragmatism. Let's call it transactionalism. And so I think that's what he is pursuing. But I don't think he wants to involve. He's not a warmonger per se. He doesn't come from that tradition of Washingtonian politics. So in that sense, yeah, he's pragmatic. Sort of a instinctive realist, not necessarily he might have defined himself as a realist, but yeah, instinctively he follows that, perhaps to a certain extent.
I would agree. I mean, Trump will engage in coercive diplomacy.
Right.
And we see this in a number of areas, especially in trade. But he has been, in both of his presidential terms, he has been remarkably reluctant to authorize the use of military force. There have been some limited engagements, certainly during his first administration, but not the initiation of full-scale wars of the types that his predecessors, for example, George W. Bush, authorized and then presided over. That's not what Donald Trump seeks to do.
So what I would like to ask you about, that this is kind of the last point you made, both of you. It's a kind of, it makes me somehow too concerned about the small countries like Georgia. Is why? Because we see that when it was the unilateral war, this might think that it might mean that small countries has no choice. And not only small countries, maybe the big countries also have no choice when it's unilateral war. But as soon as some countries started to challenge unilaterality of the United States, the hegemony of the United States, so that means that these challenges, first of all, coming to these small countries as a proxies. And this process of multipolarity has not ended yet. And still the multipolar world should be shaped. So again, are we ahead of the bigger problems, or actually these kind of the problems has already passed, and Trump with his either pragmatism can somehow to solve these kind of challenges without the new proxy wars in different areas?
Well, I think it's tempting, and I urge your viewers to resist the temptation to think that a transition of any type in international politics is going to produce a better or a more peaceful world in and of itself.
So that's what I would like to
in
ask.
and of itself. We saw this type of thinking when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. Oh, the emergence of a unipolar world is going to be a usher in a remarkably peaceful era of international politics. No, it didn't. For close to 25 years, the United States, under successive presidents, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, waged a succession of wars against a succession of regional powers or small states, Serbia, Iraq, Somalia, or against a series of non-state actors, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, or Daesh, as it was called, ostensibly to protect the interests of the United States, which they define very, very broadly. And the United States faced no effective pushback from either its existing allies, its existing regional state and small state allies, or from the other two latent great powers in the system, Russia and China. That it started to change. And there's a debate as to when that change began, whether it was the 2008 financial crisis or whether it was Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014, or whether it only really began with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. What we see now is a situation in which, yes, the United States remains the most powerful country on the planet. That is indisputable. What is also indisputable is that China has the second largest economy on the planet, and it's rapidly increased its spending on defense over the past 20 years, and it has modernized its conventional forces, and it's developed anti-access area denial capabilities in the Western Pacific, specifically in the first island chain, as well as expanded and modernized its strategic nuclear forces. Russia arguably is still a great power, although it's clearly much, much weaker than the United States and China, and it's much, much weaker than the Soviet Union ever was. But nonetheless, it has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And although the Russian Army and Air Force have not succeeded in defeating Ukraine and are unlikely to anytime soon, it is still a formidable military actor on the world stage, even though its economy is entirely based on the extraction and the export of raw materials. And it's much, much smaller than that of the economies of the other G7 countries. So we're in this environment in which there are three contending great powers, two of which are really dissatisfied with the status they have on the international stage. One of which, had been in a dominant position in the international status hierarchy and is highly reluctant to give that up, but at the same time has an administration in charge which is cognizant of, in some ways, the limitations of U.S. power, but in other ways, they haven't come to grips with it. They haven't come to grips with, the realities that, well, if you threaten to impose tariffs on other countries indiscriminately and then back down repeatedly, all you're doing is creating greater uncertainty in the global economy and greater uncertainty for American firms. And you're not succeeding in your stated objective of reshoring productive capacity to the United States. In some ways, that is kind of a delusional aim on the part of the Trump administration. The United States is never going to be competitive in the productions of certain goods and services in the way that it once was 50, 60 years ago. That's just the reality of economics. So I guess the broader point I want to make is that the transition to a multipolar international system is not something that needs to be feared. In some ways, it is just the reality. It's just simply the way that international politics works, and we, meaning humanity, have to adapt to it. It also means that small states like the Republic of Georgia have to adapt to it, a world in which there are three competing great powers.
Yeah.
And Georgia is geographically proximate to one of them, the weakest of them.
Lasha, what is your point? I mean, regarding the emerging multipolarity, what should be we concerned on, and how should we build our politics?
Well, I think that we have a chance now, in relative terms, to be safer, under less pressure. That means that with the rise of multipolarity, with the diminishing sort of influence, we are seeing this of Washington, say, in the South Caucasus, Georgia has a chance to conduct sort of pragmatic regional foreign policy and sort of be available for everyone, but not be a sort of a proxy, sort of a state that can be used or egged on against any other state. And when that was happening because there was no other challenger, basically. So now we have China, getting involved in the South Caucasus. Obviously, we know what Russia has done and wants to do and will continue to do. But the difference is the United States is sort of withdrawing, if you will, from the region. It will always have influence in the region, but it's withdrawing, and the signs of it are that the NATO expansion narrative has almost disappeared. There is a huge challenge that has been presented to this sort of a neoliberal worldview and the instruments in it with which they conducted this neoliberal foreign policy, anything from NGOs to USAID to how they were handling locally sort of the export and consolidation of this ideology, basically. But those instruments are, I think, falling apart, mainly because of this on the change on the global stage that we can feel here in the remote, if you will, South Caucasus. It's undeniable that even before 2017, we knew what was happening. There was this unilateral pressure, and then that basically disappeared with Trump's administration. And it's a recognition of the need to adjust to the changes in the international system. And we see these sort of knock-on effects on the region of that change. And I think Georgia has an opportunity to use that, in a clever way. And we, have to declare somehow that Georgia cannot afford to ally itself against any power, and that we have to maintain sort of this neutral, multi-vector foreign policy within the region. And of course, we have to be in touch and in a relationship with our Western partners. But now we get more flexibility, however, not to be sort of victims of great power politics in a way, as being sort of used as instruments against our northern neighbor. So I think with that comes stability, and with that will come sort of a regional understanding that these kinds of foolish conflicts are no longer needed. They will always be there, by the way, lurking in the background, and they will be kicked off the moment, say, Russia realizes that things are changing. Let's not be, delusional about that. But, that sort of constant pressure, because what happened with Ukraine, I'm not sure to what extent Russia is, it hasn't defined what victory is in Ukraine, but it certainly is ahead. Ukraine is obviously a weaker state in this fight, and certainly nowhere near to winning. And Russia, given its demography, its ability to produce military equipment as a result of this war, that surprised everyone, probably, perhaps, right? Yes, because these draconian sanctions, these draconian sanctions didn't really collapse its economy. The only question now is, what are the fundamentals? Is Washington going to negotiate on fundamental demands that Kremlin has? Well, in terms of Eastern Ukraine, in terms of NATO expansion. And we are seeing that it's not happening. Donald Trump just hasn't been able to close the deal, so to speak. Then the question becomes, what is Russia going to do about it? And in my view, Russia has always been prepared for this. This is existential for Russia. It's not existential for us or for Trump.
Yeah, they declared that this is existential.
Correct. So they will go to great lengths to either finish this off militarily on their own, because they say that chances for negotiated agreement are have diminished, and basically over. I don't think the Trump administration will be able to pull off a peaceful deal. And this whole idea of for a 30-day pause, ceasefire. That means nothing. I mean, what are we ceasefiring about? What are we stopping this? So we also saw that the second round of negotiations in Turkey did not bring about any results. And the whole process is in disarray, meaning, again, it will have to be solved with power and with military action. To what extent Russia is capable of taking Kiev, or whether or not there is any plans for that, we don't quite know. I don't think Russia wants to conquer or be an occupational force in Ukraine, but it definitely will take over eastern Ukraine, and it will monopolize eastern Ukraine, if not go slightly further, maybe even Odessa and so forth. I don't think Ukraine stands a chance here, and we all know how in what disarray Europe is. They make all these grandiose announcements that they're gonna find their own strategic autonomy and take care of and help out Ukraine, but it's hard for me to imagine how the European Union, let's just say France and UK or Germany, will go against Russia to defend Ukraine. And the question becomes, will it be okay with Washington? Can Europe be given sort of this autonomy to provoke Russia even more without the United States sort of interfering or stopping this? So I think it's all up to Russia at this point. How Russia is going to finish this off.
I think that I differ a little bit from Lasha's analysis in that the Europeans do have some agency. Yes, I agree.
They have some agency.
I agree that the near-term prospects that the European members of NATO could make up for a complete cessation of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine is minimal. It's not going to happen. And I don't think that anyone in Berlin, London, or Paris is under any illusions.
Right.
That if the United States were to stop providing military assistance to Ukraine and stop sharing intelligence with Ukraine, that they could make up the gap. They can't. And they know they can't. And the Ukrainians know they can't, and the Russians know that they can't. I think that much of the discussion that has happened since January 2025 about Europe pursuing strategic autonomy, whether it's through the European Union or through somebody else, and building an integrated defense capability, an integrated defense industrial base. This has been more medium to long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking. What do we need to do over the next decade to have a viable, continent-wide defense industrial base? What do we need to do to create a rapid reaction force to deal with regional contingencies in case the United States, either isn't interested in participating in a regional contingency or it just simply withdraws the means for U.S. forces to participate in a military contingency. I think that in those three capitals, London, Berlin, and Paris, there is a palpable fear of the United States scaling back its security commitments to Europe altogether. And again, that's not an immediate risk. This is a longer-term risk, a future-oriented risk, as most abandonment fears on the part of smaller allies generally are. It's not what an ally might do tomorrow that is of concern. It's what that ally might do 6 months from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now that is of concern. As for what Russia's aims are at this point in the Russian-Ukraine war, well, it's clear that Vladimir Putin is not willing to sign a 30-day ceasefire that freezes the battle lines where they are, because let's face it, the balance of forces generally favors Russia, despite the fact that Ukraine has been able to carry out some devastating aerial attacks and submarine attacks on Russian military assets in the past 2 weeks, which were hugely embarrassing for the Russians.
Yeah.
Hugely embarrassing and arguably escalatory. But Russia doesn't have an incentive to escalate the war to the strategic level. That would be catastrophic for everyone.
Yeah.
Nor does it really see a need to escalate the war vertically. Let's keep the fighting contained to Ukraine. The Ukraine war is going to go on for the foreseeable future, with both sides jockeying for better advantage. I think it eventually will end with a negotiated settlement of some type. I don't know what the exact parameters of that settlement will be, but I think it will end, with a negotiated settlement and not a crushing victory for the Russians, and certainly not for the Ukrainians.
It won't be a decisive victory.
It will not be a decisive victory. But then again, most interstate wars end with negotiated settlements, not with a decisive victory on the part of one side or over the other.
But let me just interject here. Do you think, though, whatever the negotiated settlement will be, Russia by that time will have had its most of its strategic goals achieved?
It'll have many of its strategic goals.
NATO would be the first.
Well, the promise that was made by officials in the George W. Bush administration at the 2008 Lisbon summit, that Ukraine and Georgia would be put on the path to NATO membership, was incredibly irresponsible at the time, because there never was a credible path for these two states to be admitted to NATO membership. There never was, an effort to modernize their militaries, to ensure that there would be interoperability with NATO forces. There never was the type of political consultations necessary to bring these states into the alliance. And Russia made it very clear very early on that the admission of Ukraine and or Georgia to NATO membership was unacceptable to them. This was known. And the notion that somehow, Ukraine and Georgia might be on some type of path toward NATO membership in some undefined time frame was incredibly damaging to both U.S.-Russia relations, but also to domestic politics in Ukraine and in Georgia. It was never a viable option. There was never support among the other NATO members for the accession of Ukraine and Georgia to the alliance, because the European members of NATO knew that Russia considered these two states to be part of its sphere of influence, and they were not going to give it up.
Yeah.
They certainly were not going to give it up. So for Georgia, at this point, the most prudent course of action would be pragmatism. And by pragmatism, I mean acknowledging the fact that, while, quote, integration with the West is a nice slogan and a nice aspiration, it's a little difficult to do as a practical matter, given that you share a long border with Russia, given that the United States and Russia have fought a proxy war in Ukraine, and given the lack of enthusiasm on the part of the other European members of the NATO alliance for this particular state's, Georgia in this case's, ascension to NATO. It's just not likely to happen.
usually the critiques of this idea, what you have said, they usually said that the integration into NATO or any other military alliance or any other political alliance and etc. is a kind of sovereign right of these small countries or any other countries and etc. Is that idealistic view of the world, which is not working in the realism?
I'm going to get in trouble with my colleagues at the Fletcher School who are international lawyers.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to do that here. It is not realistic. Yes, on paper, it is the sovereign right of every state, every member state of the United Nations to choose to forge alliances with other states, to join international organizations. But, sovereignty applies to, or particular sovereign rights apply to some states more than it applies to other states. And that has always been the case. That has always been the case in international politics, and that always will be the case in international politics. So yes, while some in Georgia may say it's our sovereign right to apply for membership, in NATO or the European Union or any other international organization or multilateral organization, it's also the sovereign right of the existing member states of that institution to reject that application or to not act on that application. And I think that reality is, what Georgia and Ukraine and other small states have to contend with. The other member states of those institutions have their own strategic interests, have their own relationships with Russia and with the United States, and they make calculations based on both the existing distribution of power, but also what they think the distribution of power might be in the future. And I don't see a scenario in which those calculations on the part of other member states of NATO or of the European Union are going to change. And say, oh, sure, we're going to move quickly and act on these applications in the case of EU membership, or sure, we're going to invite Ukraine and Georgia into a formal process of ascension to NATO. That's just not going to happen.
Lasha, please.
Just on that point, to be just crude, basically power decides what your rights are, correct? I mean, just boil this down to what we discuss, correct, yeah. So this is Realism 101, basically. I mean, it doesn't matter what you want. We're talking about a state, and we're talking about the Russian Federation that has its own national security interests, and it will, and by the way, this whole idea of Russia being weak, first of all, it's much more powerful now. Second of all, even when it was down and out, let's just say during the first two wars in Chechnya, it still managed brutally, inefficiently, of course, this is the Russian way, but it still managed to reincorporate Chechnya and nip it in the bud, whatever was going on back then, as Russia saw, as an attempt by Western powers, if you will. I mean, there's always a connection there, right, rhetorical at least, to say that it was, Chechnya's wars were caused by another Western, one of the first signs of Western hubris. Okay,
but it was much more weaker Russia than it is today.
That's my point. Yeah. That's my point. And it was much weaker in 2008. Russia's invasion of Georgia was very inefficient, even though it had plenty of hardware, plenty more of hardware in the first few days. They embarrassed themselves, but it doesn't matter. What matters is eventually, in 48 hours later, they picked up and they did what they did in Georgia. They occupied, and now we have geopolitically and strategically so we went from bad to worse. Now we have Abkhazia, South Ossetia recognized. Even though it's just Russia or Venezuela and a couple of other small states, but it's undeniable that Russia is much more than capable, especially now that it has sort of tasted the warfare in Ukraine, to nip in the bud any attempts which won't occur anytime soon again. Of Western meddling in the South Caucasus. So this whole idea of Russia wasn't capable, or its tanks were old Soviet leftover junk. It was just hubris. They were intoxicated by this rhetoric, and we all know where it was coming from. But that's what got us in trouble. We basically got in trouble because of idealist hubris, propaganda, and these things were not studied, they were not analyzed, they were not questioned, and they were not looked at critically. And so that's, we got 2008. And so now I think reality has set in, and it said there were no fundamental reasons why this was why this was happening, why Georgia, got in trouble with South Ossetia. It was all just sort of inertia of this idealism. We are with you, America is with you, collective West is with you, and we gobbled it all up basically. And that's very unfortunate. But,
I would agree with that.
yeah.
So, by the end of our conversation, I would like to go back to the multipolarity from the slightly different perspective. So, it was told by you gentlemen that there are very important what will be okay for US. So, to understand that, what is okay for the US, I would like to understand what kind of the new world order shape is okay for the United States, because there are an idea within the scholars, some of them, that the second best option for the United States is the multipolarity, then bipolar world, where another pole is China, which can somehow which means that there's some countries like Russia or maybe other countries have to be under the influence of China. So this was also, as I understand, the main idea of the Kissinger, that the United States should not push Russia towards the China with this war and et cetera, and et cetera. So what do you think the versus to the unipolarity, what is the better for the United States, bipolar world or multipolar world?
I think, first of all, I think we have to distinguish between two things.
Right.
Number one, polarity. Polarity simply refers to the number of great powers in an international system at any given time. It refers to the distribution of power. That's it. That is separate from international order. International order refers to the types of institutions and rules and norms which are supposed to govern an international system, which are almost always created by the more powerful states in an international system, and which are continually negotiated and reinterpreted by the participating states. So polarity and international order are distinct. Now, as for what type of polarity, what type of international system is better for the United States, I have real problems with that question, because it presumes that the United States or any state, can choose what the distribution of power is. And it can't. Yes, they could do things to augment its own power and to decrease, the power of other states. But it's not as if, this is a choice in which the United States is in a cafeteria and is choosing among, 3 alternative entrees. Oh, I'll have the Salisbury steak as opposed to the chicken, Kiev. Or I'll have, the tofu burger. It doesn't work like that. The United States has existed as a sovereign state under different configurations of power in the international system since it asserted its independence from Britain in 1776. And it will continue to exist under different configurations of power for the foreseeable future. So it's not as if bipolarity in and of itself was necessarily good for the United States, or unipolarity in and of itself was necessarily bad for the United States. It just was. Now, with respect to international order, the type of international order that the United States helped set up in the latter part of the Second World War into the post-World War II era, and that later the United States attempted to globalize in the 1990s after the demise of the Soviet Union, the other pole, that order is coming apart. that order, began to show signs of real structural problems as early as the 1970s, with the unilateral decision by the Nixon administration to take the United States off the gold standard, and the decision was made after 1990 to try to not only try to perpetuate that international order, but to try to expand it to other parts of the globe. And that's what the United States did for the next 25 years. That system has proved to be unsustainable. So, the various institutions that the United States set up in the decade after the Second World War, which the United States has undermined and worked around, they aren't coming back. They aren't coming back. Yes, so the International Monetary Fund still exists. The World Bank still exists.
Yeah.
The United States works around them. Security Council was set up by the United States to favor the strategic interests of the United States. But others, have been clamoring for decades, well, why is it that the United States, Britain, France, Russia, as the successor state of the former Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, why are they the 5 permanent veto-bearing members of the Security Council? Why not why not Brazil? Why not India? Well, because it was in the interest of those 5 states to preserve their privileged status. So, what type of international order will replace the one that's currently crumbling? At this point, I cannot say. I think we are less likely to see the types of formal global international institutions that the United States helped create and helped sustain in the past in some new type of order. I think that relations between states are going to be more transactional. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing in some areas. In some areas, I don't think that's a bad thing. In other areas, there may need to be some different types of institutions which are created. The final point which I'm going to make is that it's important not to set up institutions as this great panacea for all of humanity's problems and all collective action problems in international politics, because institutions themselves are venues in which states pursue their national interests. They are venues for power politics. And one ought never lose sight of that the states that set up the institutions, the states that operate within an institution, are trying to advance their own national interests as they see fit. And that sometimes, that can produce some very strange coalitions. Sometimes it can produce some unintended consequences. But states are always engaged in some type of positional competition with other states. So I realize that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
It was great. Yes,
Sure.
You can respond on that.
Yeah, I can just simply build on that. So Professor gave obviously an excellent analysis on what the international system is. I would just say, United States, just to answer your question, the United States might prefer one or the other international order and might follow the preference. I think in the past 30 years, I think it would be fair to say that it preferred sort of unipolar, right? So unilateral engagement in the world, but the preference doesn't really mean anything. Even the United States cannot structure and sew international system to its taste, right? You can't control what other states are going to do eventually. So look, the expectation of the Sino-Soviet split was what? That we're going to bring China into this post-World War II liberal institutional order, hoping that China was going to collapse, its Communist Party was going to collapse or reform and become one happy capitalist state. That would have been a colossal triumph. But we see that it failed, that plan. To a certain extent, I think they're still lamenting about it. They still hate the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is extremely powerful. And so they have to deal with it. So the idea that we can have wishful thinking,
Yeah.
but we see how that did not produce beneficial results for the United States. But it doesn't matter. Does it really matter? It doesn't matter because the United States is the most powerful state in the world. It is protected. It is in between two large bodies of water. And there is no single power that can cross the shore, reach the shores of the United States and threaten its existence. It's a laughable thought. So what it is sure, we can go out there, offshore balance. We can, go out there and say, UK, help us out in Europe, and if you fail, we'll come in at some point. Use some, sort of umbrella principles of protecting our allies in Europe. I think that era is over, right? The Cold War era is over in many respects. But generally speaking, who cares, right? So the United States just sits back and watches this unfold, maybe reluctantly. And they understand Security Council, the 5 members, is a perfect example of this. It was never meant to be this la-la land. Those 5 powers, the creation of those veto power meant that there would always be national security interests, state interests of great powers. They tried sort of to step away from it and say, let's just build something that is more liberal and friendly. But just like we've been sort of alluding throughout this conversation, there was always sort of brutal realpolitik. No state will ever jeopardize its own interests as it sees fit. So I think that's the dynamic we're playing with. And even though now the international system has changed, the United States will continue on, and it will be a major, power that will learn how to deal with China or Russia, and just life will go on, basically.
Life will go on.
Yeah.
So let me finish our conversation with the kind of question regarding the optimist. I don't know how much realist could be optimist, but anyway, I would like to ask you about that. So what do you feel? I mean, the world order, international order, which you mentioned, with the 5 permanent members of having veto, was built on the really serious crisis, really serious catastrophe, which was the Second World War. So what do you feel about contemporary world? Are we at the path towards the catastrophe, and we need to pass through that catastrophe to build a new world order, or we can somehow the lesson learned from the past and to organize the new international order without this scale of catastrophe, avoiding it.
Is your question that are we at the precipice of a major war between the United States and Russia and China?
Something like that, yes. Do we need it before we can arrange the new international order?
Not necessarily, and I don't think that we're on the precipice of a catastrophic war between the United States and China, or between the United States and Russia at the time. I mean, yes, there will always be some residual risk, but I think that risk is still in manageable ranges.
Yeah.
I don't buy into the whole Thucydides trap notion that the United States and China are foredoomed to get into a military conflict with each other, because that's what the pattern of rising powers and declining great powers has been for the past 5,000 years. I don't buy into that, in part because it denies agency to the actual leaders of those states and the choices that they have.
Neoclassical realism,
Yes, I'm a neoclassical realist. I'm considered one of the prominent scholars in neoclassical realism among many. Constructing international orders are hard, and international orders do not last forever.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, the example was given during one of our panels yesterday of the Concert of Europe, which lasted for a quarter of a century. I mean, ultimately broke down in the Crimean War. So, but still, I mean, that period from 1815, the final defeat of Napoleon, in the War of the Third Coalition, to the outbreak of the Crimean War, 1854, that was a pretty long period. Relative to other international orders. The international order which came into existence after the Second World War. The fact that, we're talking about the collapse of this order 80 years after it began to come into existence, I think shows that it was a, quote, remarkably long-lived order. But I don't necessarily think that we need another cataclysmic war to bring about a new international order. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not sure what this new international order would look like. Perhaps there are pieces of it that are already in existence that I'm not, paying attention to. But I do think that we are unlikely to see a reconstitution of that liberal international order that the United States created after the Second World War and which it's led for the past 8 decades. I don't see that happening.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just, yes, basically, it will continue to shape the way, so whatever this change has caused, it will just continue on. Correct, we won't see the return to that liberal institutionalism. But there is, though, however, there is this, maybe it's alarmism of the nuclear threats. This is the first time since the 90s that we are hearing the nuclear weapons usage possibility rhetoric coming in with Russia possibly threatening it, right? We've heard that.
But Russia has rattled the nuclear saber since February 2022 about every 3 weeks. About every 3 weeks.
I personally don't think we are in danger of that.
No, I don't think
but
we're
what I'm
in
saying
danger
is, but in public debates, you hear this, and you wonder whether it has any meaning behind it, or it's just because the folks who are supporting this war, say in the West, they don't care. Like they say Russia is going to bluff. So Russia is bluffing, nobody's going to use nuclear weapons, and yet some others folks, perhaps even from the realist camp, are saying, why are we increasing tensions? This is the last thing we need now for Russia to seriously start considering if it's cornered as a result of this conflict to use nuclear weapons, because after all, Ukraine is existential to Russia. So that concept allows, right? It's permissive. We can think about, right? Or,
yes, except that the use of even tactical nuclear weapons on the part of Russia would be self-defeating. And Putin knows this.
To what extent, though? Do you think the West will retaliate? The West won't retaliate.
It would make Ukraine, or large portions of it, uninhabitable and very difficult for Russia to extract resources from for the foreseeable future. So if the Ukraine issue is existential for Russia, why would it want to damage this asset for
in
which
terms
it is
of
fighting?
Yes, I agree with that.
So that doesn't make any sense.
It will need Ukraine to be its economic asset
It
eventually.
would definitely need Ukraine to be its economic asset, considering the fact that if Russia were to accept the ceasefire offer that had been made. Yes, arguably it'd be better off than it had been, continuing the war. But why would it put itself at a disadvantage? Why would it put itself in a position of having to govern over an irradiated Ukrainian territory?
Well,
Yes, we're in a new nuclear age, that's for sure. We have 3 nuclear-armed great powers, 6 nuclear-armed regional powers, 1 nuclear latent regional power, Iran. And so the calculations for nuclear deterrence and strategy are going to be more complicated than they were during the Cold War. But I don't think we're on the precipice
no, we're not.
of seeing a nuclear exchange, or even have a heightened likelihood of seeing a nuclear exchange in the foreseeable future.
But this is the first time we're hearing about it publicly, sort of. Even it's an alarmism.
It's
perhaps.
an alarmism,
yeah.
but Lasha, I'm a decade older than you.
Sure.
Although I don't look it. I'm a decade older than you.
You don't look it, no.
And I distinctly remember, 1983.
Yeah.
When I was in middle school, there was a television drama called The Day After. And it was a fictional story of a hypothetical nuclear exchange between the United States and the then Soviet Union, and specifically about its impact on Kansas City, Missouri, and suburbs of Kansas City. And this program, which aired, on ABC television, was one of the most watched programs in the history of broadcast television.
Okay.
And it scared the hell out of millions of people. Millions upon millions of people saw this in real time and were horrified. Now you can see the complete, the complete movie the day after, starring Jason Robards, on YouTube. And the special effects are primitive compared to, what we see on television programs nowadays in 2025. But it had this tremendous galvanizing effect. Were we at a heightened risk of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union in 1983? In retrospect, no, we weren't. I mean, yes, there was that whole Able Archer, incident. But, were the United States and Soviet Union on the precipice of launching missiles against each other in 1983? No, they really weren't. And within 6 years, the dynamics between the United States and the Soviet Union had fundamentally changed.
Right.
Fundamentally changed. So I guess, although I tend to be a more pessimistic person, I'm also a person who wants to avoid catastrophizing and who always will look to the possibilities that there are ways out of particular situations. I don't think that we are in a situation among the three nuclear-armed great powers.
No,
I don't think
we're
we're in a situation as tense as some of the previous bilateral crises between the two. And I don't think that we're likely to see a nuclear exchange in the near future, at least among those three states.
So you believe that all the owners of the nuclear weapon are reasonable people? I mean, reasonable actors.
I mean, they don't necessarily have to be reasonable actors or rational actors, and we can have a very long debate about what rationality is and how that term effectively becomes meaningless. They're self-interested actors. They realize, that, or people around them realize that the consequences of a nuclear exchange, even a limited nuclear exchange, would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the risk of a nuclear exchange has suddenly dramatically increased.
Okay. Professor Taliaferro, Mr. Kasradze, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your ideas with us, and wish you good luck.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Have a nice flight back.
Thank you so much. I look forward to visiting Georgia again.
Yes, you're kindly welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.